Why does D&D have wandering monsters? When were they added to the game and how are they supposed to be used? We're going to talk about wandering monsters today on Daddy Roll the One. Today's video is once again sponsored by me and my new book kickstarting on June 3rd called Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions. It's all about playing expert and specialist characters and also provides information for referees to add experts and specialists to their campaigns. It's designed for old school essentials, but it's really going to work with any kind of class and level fantasy adventure game, particularly ones that were from the old school style. So it's going to be available as both a PDF and a print on demand. And I have a new announcement to make, which is that I'm also going to be offering an upgrade to a hardcover version that's going to have a brand new cover that my designer and artist friend is working on as we speak. So there's going to be various different pledge levels, and you'll also have the choice to choose between a plain white background for easier reading or a classic parchment style background. So if you would like to learn more, please sign up for my pre-launch Kickstarter page. The link is down below, so you'll be notified when the product goes live on Kickstarter. Thank you so very much for your support. I'd like to thank my Superfans who are helping to make this content possible. Randy Andrews, Agile Monk 6305, and Fatal Devotee 1. So if you'd like to join them as a super fan, click on the super link below and help support Daddy Roll the One. Thanks. Hello there and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on DM advice, but also on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, because I'm going to be talking about a concept, wandering monsters, and where, why, and how it came into the game. So if you are into the history videos, please don't be put off by the fact that I'm labeling this as DM advice, because it really does more, I guess, involve history. But I'm going to be talking about how I use wandering monsters in my game as well, and that's kind of where the DM advice part comes from. So I'm going to cover how wandering monsters were introduced to the game, and in fact, they predate Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about that in a second here. And then get into how they are addressed in different versions of early D&D, going up through second edition, kind of what was the prevailing, attitude about using wandering monsters in the game. I'm going to show some specific examples from some old adventures here, some old modules that you'll see here. And then, talk about like why people don't like them. That's a big part of wandering monsters. It's something that I've talked about before on Twitter. I asked people, like, do people use wandering monsters, or, do people like random encounters? And, I don't think the results are going to surprise anybody from that, but it was overwhelmingly like negative. And I'm going to talk about why I think that is, and based on comments that people made. And at the end of the video, I am going to talk about, show some real life examples of how I use wandering monsters, maybe how to implement them in your game to make them a little less, feel at least a little less random. Okay, so starting out, interestingly enough, now this is Dave Arneson's first fantasy campaign. We've talked about this so many times, but again, as a reminder, this book, although it's published in 1977, this is a collection of Dave Arneson's notes on his home campaign of Blackmoor, which was the first fantasy campaign. That's why it's called that, because at this point he's left TSR and he, I don't want to say he doesn't have the rights to use it, because the interior of the book says Blackmoor, all throughout. Okay, it's very, you'll see here, and even in the table of contents. But on the cover, I guess they just couldn't use that, and this is published by Judges Guild. So again, while this is published in 77, it is covering Dave Arneson's campaign, dating all the way back to 1970, 1971. Okay, and you see here on page. In my copy, it's on page 45, and it says Wandering Monster Areas, levels 1 through 6. The convention set has the wandering monsters pre-generated by areas. Players rolling a wandering monster in Quadrant A will have encountered Sir Fang. Now, we've talked about Sir Fang before, but that is the vampire character played by David Fant, or Fant, I think it's Fant, F-A-N-T. And he created a vampire character because, at the time, and we just talked about this in my last video, a lot of the players were really into things like Dark Shadows. And they were also, Dave Arneson was watching all these old monster movies on TV. There was like a weekend marathon on Channel 5 in Minneapolis that would show all these old monster movies, including old Dracula and House of Dracula and, all the different Draculas, right? So in any event, there's a note here about wandering monsters. Now, some people have suggested it's possible that Dave could have added to his notes post-publication of Dungeons and Dragons, and that's why this note is in here about wandering monsters. I don't know that we're ever going to know that for sure unless we can get a hold of a legitimate, all the way back in the 70s pre-D&D notes for Blackmoor. And at this point, I'm not sure that those exist anymore. Because I think, Dave was running this game and a lot of it wasn't written down. A lot of what he wrote down was specifically for the purpose of including it in Dungeons and Dragons. And once you get him starting to interact with Gary and sharing notes back and forth and mailing his notes to them, it does start to get a little bit muddied, unfortunately, as to, again, and I just talked about this in my last video, but like what specifically did Dave include and what did Gary include? I've seen other versions of First Fantasy Campaign that are actually shorter than my version here, where the note on Wandering Monsters occurs on page 30 instead of on mine. It occurs here on page 45, as you see. But I've seen a PDF version of this where the Wandering Monster areas is on page 30. And so I wonder if perhaps I do have a later version where there's more added. But in any event, it was in that earlier version. If that is indeed an earlier version, I don't know the provenance of this version I've seen that is, has fewer pages. Mine has, I think, 88 pages. And the one that I saw, okay, it's actually 92. The one that I saw, the PDF version was only 64. Okay, but it looks as though Wandering Monsters predate the publication of D&D. Now, that said, it's a little bit less about, where they came from originally, because we're going to be talking about their use in D&D. So this is Booklet 3, Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, from original Dungeons & Dragons, published in 1974. This is, of course, a later printing. It'd be nice if I had the original printing, but that's at this point not in the cards unless I just stumble across it at like a garage sale or something. But here we are on page 10. Okay. And it says Wandering Monsters. At the end of every turn, so in this case, it's every turn, the referee will roll a 6-sided die to see if a wandering monster has been encountered. A roll of 6 indicates a wandering monster has appeared. The direction and appearance is determined by a random number generation considering the number of possible entries. Distance and surprise are decided in the usual manner. The kind of monster is determined on the table below. For wilderness encounters, an entirely different table will be used. And then it gives you this table, how many levels you are beneath the surface. Consult the monster level table number. And then, you see here's your monster level tables, and it'll tell you like what you're going to find. Okay. So that's original D&D, 1974. Okay. So just really quickly, I just want to talk about a few other places where you see it show up. Okay, so this is the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979. Again, I always point this out because some people get confused by this, but this is a later printing with the, the Jeff Easley cover and the orange spine, but it is still the original, first edition, not second edition Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, as we can see here with this note from the editor, Mike Carr, who, if you saw some of my previous videos, I got a chance to meet him recently at the end of April 2024 at DaveCon, and I got to interview him for a little bit, and he signed my copy of Dawn Patrol. But anyway, this game has Wandering Monsters. And what's interesting here, all the way on page 9, all the way at the beginning, I should say, introduction. So Gary says the final word then is the game. Read how and why the system is as it is, follow the parameters, and then cut portions as needed to maintain excitement. For example, the rules call for wandering monsters, but these can be not only irritating, if not deadly, but the appearance of such can actually spoil a game by interfering with an orderly expedition for when your players have set up an area full, if you've set up an area full of clever tricks and traps, populated it with well thought out creatures and complexes, and given out clues about it to pique your players' interest, and the groups worked hard to supply themselves with everything by way of information and equipment they will need to face, overcome imagined perils, and they're going to gather together and spend an enjoyable evening playing their favorite game, and then because of the wandering monsters, basically things happen that make it bad, and they might have a bad experience. So he's basically saying, like, use your experience and your gut essentially to let you know if you should actually roll for the wandering monsters. And he says, however, they are included for 2 reasons as explained in the section about them. I don't really think he gets as much into why he includes them in here. They're mentioned at various points throughout the text that they're in here. But the main part really kind of comes. He talks about assuming that the proper activity is kept up and the castle is finished, then the player characters can encourage to take up residence in Stronghold, patrol the territory about once a week, blah, blah, blah. It talks about rolling for wandering monsters, and then it says use Appendix C, random monster encounters. Okay, so it talks about it there. There's multiple places in here where it talks about, rolling for wandering monsters. But again, I don't really, I reread this again. I read it when I was a kid. I reread it once again just to kind of make sure. And I couldn't find a very definitive explanation for why Gary says to use wandering monsters. I have my own reasons of why I think that they should be in the game. But if you remember where that was, because again, I spent like an hour or 2 this morning reading through every section that I could find in here that talked about wandering monsters, and I didn't find a specific definition as to why. But here's Appendix C, random monster encounters. Now, what's interesting is this is random monster encounters, which are not technically wandering monsters. We're splitting hairs here, but technically random encounters are different than wandering monsters, but they're related. Because an encounter doesn't have to be a monster. At least I don't think it needs to be. And a lot of modern design done in an old school format kind of leans into this idea that like an encounter isn't always a monster. It could be, an environment or weather or an item or, a landmark, something like that. But in any event, that's what this section is all about, is like how to roll for monsters and what level they are and what monsters you're going to be. And he has them divided up here by by dungeon and wilderness and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's AD&D. My point is wandering monsters are in here. However, already 1979, just a few years after the debut of D&D in 1974, Gary's already saying, well, yeah, it tells you that wandering monsters are in here and you should roll for them. However, use your judgment because maybe you don't want to roll for them for, reasons, right? Okay, so that's that. Now, I'm going to skip to 1981. You've seen this before. This is the version of the game I started with, as well as the version I'm currently running for my daughter and her friends. Okay, so she's 14 now. She's about 11 when we started. But there is a section in here in the back about wandering monsters. This is page 53, I think. Yep. The B is for basic. Okay, and here it says, besides the monsters which live in rooms, characters may encounter monsters which wander about the dungeon. These monsters are known as wandering monsters, and at the end of every 2 turns. So remember, in the original D&D, it said every turn. This says every 2 turns. The DM should check for wandering monsters, and to do so, roll a d6 on a result of 1 that indicates that the party will encounter a wandering monster in the next turn. And what's interesting is, if you remember, in here, you rolled a d6, and if you got a 6, you got a wandering monster. Here, it's roll a d6, and if you get a 1. So it's the same idea. It's the same percentage chance of it happening. It's just interesting that it does that. Now, one of the things that it says is that the wandering monsters will be between 20 and 120 feet away from the party when encountered in a direction the DM's choosing, and then will be headed towards the player characters. And it said they may be determined at random, or they can be selected by the DM. The wandering monster tables below give a balanced mixture of monsters for the dungeon level, and the DM may create his or her own tables. Okay, that's a key point. The dungeon may have certain areas where wandering monsters are encountered more often, such as on a roll of 1 or 2. The dungeon may have areas where DM checks, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then it gets in there. It says wandering monsters should appear more often as if the party is making a lot of noise or light. but it should not be frequent if the party spent a long time in one out-of-the-way place. So again, these are all important things that are going to come up later in my discussion. All right, and then it says you might want to create special wandering monster tables for specific and parts of the dungeon. Okay, so that's basic D&D 1981 for what is going to eventually become known as the BX rule set or Moldvay Basic. All right, now one last thing is going to be in the second edition Advanced D&D Dungeon Master's Guide. This is 1989, and I actually don't own this as a print copy, so I've mentioned before, but just briefly, when second edition came out, I had moved. I'd lost my group. I was in the middle of trying to find a new group, and when I found some people, they were playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, not D&D at the time. So I got the D&D second edition player handbook because I wanted to read about it and see what was going on. I just didn't get the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it took me a while to end up getting the monsters books because my group wasn't playing it. Okay, but in any event, if you see here, what's interesting is it talks about wandering monsters, and it is in this section on random encounters. And in this book, it says a lot of people think that random encounters are foolish because it interferes with the story and that you're losing DM control because the DM should control everything that's happening in the game and they shouldn't be surprised by what's going to happen, and that they can be abused through overuse. Okay, so that's kind of where the second edition is coming from. At least they're relating what other people say, but it seems pretty clear that's what they're leading with is the idea that like you probably shouldn't use. And this is, but there's good reasons why you can use them. And then it gives you two very weak reasons. It says that you should use it for variety, just to mix things up. And then you can use it as a DM challenge because maybe the DM wants to be thinking on his or her feet and have to figure out how to integrate a wandering monster into a game session when it's a monster that they hadn't planned on being there. So again, I think those are kind of weak, and they actually go against what I think wandering monsters should be used for. Okay, so let's talk about then, why do people really hate wandering monsters? So when I did ask on Twitter, again, it was pretty overwhelming that especially newer gamers, people that are brand new to the game, don't like them. But you can see going all the way back to second edition, 1989. So what is that, like 30 years ago or, ish? I don't know. I'm not doing math in my head right now. 35 maybe. You can see that people already were saying they didn't like them because it's interfering with the story. And that is overwhelmingly the attitude that I got from people on Twitter, that people commented on. They said, I have a story and wandering monsters just screw it up because it's just taking time to do something that doesn't move my story forward. It doesn't move this, what the player characters are doing. Like I know what they should be doing. And I have this like scripted out. And because of that, when you throw in a wandering monster and just like a pack of goblins shows up and starts attacking them, like what's the point of that other than just to have combat? And I don't want to do that. So I think there's a lot of really bad misconceptions in that idea of like why you would have a wandering monster there in the first place and what its purpose is and what it should consist of. But just to talk about story really quick. So I know a lot of old timers are going to balk against this idea of like the story and like having this kind of thing all planned out, scripted out, what you're going to do, and say that's not real D&D. Well, that's essentially what Dragonlance is. These come out in 84, I think. It might have even been 83, but I want to say it's 1984. I didn't open them to check the copyright. But these were hugely popular. I play D&D with a guy that he's my age. He's like 3 weeks older than me. His first exposure to D&D was this. So to him, playing D&D in this format where you are part of this like group of heroes that are predestined to go achieve great things and save the world and do all that kind of stuff, the way a lot of modern players play now, like in the 5e era, he started doing that in first edition. And to him, that's playing D&D. And playing any other way, like starting like the zero to hero idea, like starting as an adventurer who's just trying to get a few gold pieces to like pay their way through life and hope that they survive. Like he really rebels against playing that way. And it's because he started with this. Now, there's a lot of people online, a lot of trolls, and a lot of folks that will try to stir the pot and say like this isn't real D&D. Like I'm not going to get into people I've seen say that, but there's a lot of people that will say like, this isn't real D&D. It's fine that that's not real D&D to you. It is D&D. It says it right here on the package. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. These things sold so well that they sold them for years. These went up. I have the first 6, but I only got out the first 4 off the shelf. They went all the way up through 16, and then they started doing new ones where they changed the DL to like different. It was D something else. I don't know what it was, but like they changed it, and they kept publishing these multiple campaign settings, like box sets that came out. This stuff sold to thousands and thousands of people. And if it didn't sell, they wouldn't kept printing it. Like, they're a business. They, granted, they made some mistakes with their businesses later on, but at the time when this came out, they were still writing pretty high. And there's no reason that they would have kept publishing these if it wasn't making them money. Also, the novels sold like, hotcakes. So I think that trying to say that this isn't real D&D, again, it might not be the way that you play. It doesn't mean it's not real, and it doesn't mean it's not a valid way of playing. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox now, but I wanted to bring that up. However, kind of the flip side of that is that when you do play that way, and I'm not saying Dragonlance specifically, but this idea of like having this scripted story that you've written out. If you kind of know how your campaign's going to end, that your player characters at the end that you're DMing through, that the player characters are going to fight, the big bad evil guy or whatever it is, and kind of roughly when and where that's going to happen, what the circumstances are, and what is going to happen along the way before to get the player characters to that point where they take care in that battle. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying, to me, that sounds more like a novel. And I've played with DMs who do play that way. And, sometimes it can still be fun. To me, sometimes it can feel a little like I don't have a lot of agency to do what, I would want my character to do. But again, I'm not trying to lambast that way of playing, because it is a legitimate way, and a lot of people are really into playing D&D more for those story aspects than they are for the game mechanics and the and kind of like the procedural stuff that happens in these early versions. Okay, so that's fine, but I do think that when you do play that way, what's going to happen is your player characters are going to figure out pretty quickly that everything that happens then is important and is leading them towards something else that they're going to be doing. So it means, like, if you don't have encounters that aren't driving your story, then the player characters are going to approach the game differently. And I think that's a missed opportunity. Again, it's me. That's my way of playing. But I think that there's something to be said for using the game mechanics that are in the game for, as an example, wandering monsters, to allow for some mystery, some creativity, and the unexpected to emerge through randomness of dice and things like random encounters and wandering monsters. Okay, so that's going to lead me to, why do we use wandering monsters? Really quick before I get to why, I just want to show you some examples of how wandering monsters show up in some of these very early publications. So this is In Search of the Unknown, also by Mike Carr. So we've talked briefly about this before. Published in 1979. Originally, it was part of the Holmes Basic set before it was bumped for this one. But there is a table in here for wandering monsters. Here we go. So it says check every third turn. A 1 on a 6, roll a 6-sided die. If a monster is indicated, roll a 6-sided die again and compare it to this table below. So Mike Carr's created his own table of wandering monsters that might be in the caverns of Quasqueton. Okay, so orcs, giant centipedes, kobolds, troglodytes, giant rats, and berserkers. So that's his table for that part of the module. Okay, like what the random monsters might be. This is a great introductory learning module for DMs who have never DM'd before. It's It even says it's an introductory module on here. So it often gets overlooked for this one. This one was published in much higher levels of frequency. So there are more copies of this out there than there are this, but both of them do a really good job of teaching you how to be a DM, just teaching you in completely different ways. Okay. But anyway, that's that. And then you have here in B2, Caves of Chaos. Now you guys have heard I was running my daughter through this. Her group finished this and they're now in Saltmarsh. But when they were going through this, there is, of course, random wandering monsters tables here. Now what's interesting is what Gary does is he picks up the wandering monster tables from here, from this book. These are not specific to this adventure. He's just picking up the tables by level of the dungeon, level 1, level 2, level 3, and what would be on there. Okay. So I'm going to talk about why I don't use those, why I didn't use these in this adventure. And that's the part you're going to want to make sure you stick around for. Is at the end of this, I'm going to get into how do I show you some real life examples of how I use wandering monsters to make them more more fun, more unique, more creative in a game versus just rolling on a table that wasn't keyed to the adventure that you're actually running. All right. So that's that. There's some in here as well, but I think you get the point. I'm just showing you some adventures that my characters have been through. They haven't been through B1, but that was one of the first ones. Okay. So again, talking about this idea of why do we use wandering monsters? So there's a lot of reasons. Okay, I'll just put it that way. However, I'm going to boil it down to two kind of broad stroke reasons why you would use them. And the first is going to be because they make the environment seem lived in. Okay, so I know that seems simple and easy, but the idea is that if all of the monsters are stuck in a lair or a room or whatever you want to call it, and they're just there waiting for the PCs to come encounter them, it starts to feel very video game like, I guess, for instance, where you know that something's going to be there because it's been so long since you haven't seen anything, and then you walk into the room and then there's the monster just sitting there, hasn't heard anything, doesn't know you're coming, or somehow didn't know that you were there, and you just pop in and surprise them. So one of the things that's fun is if you have your wandering monsters roaming around through, they used to call them hallway monsters kind of originally. Almost the idea is you had some monsters that were keyed to a lair, and a lot of that comes from that Blackmoor thing. And then some of them that didn't have a lair, but they're still in a dungeon. And so they're roaming the hallways. Okay. And so, but if you put them out there, it makes it seem like they're just going about their business. And then maybe they are hunting the PCs. Maybe they've heard them. Maybe they've heard rumors. Someone's reported they killed a group of goblins and one of them got away and reported and said these guys are out there. And so now everyone's on high alert and they're wandering through looking for them. Those are all reasons why you might come across some wandering monsters. However, their actions don't have to lead to combat. That is a common misconception. And it's one of the ones that it really kind of, I think, makes people avoid wanting to use wandering monsters, because the perception is it's a group of, or a party of unrelated creatures that aren't relevant to the adventure show up and your group has to fight them for no reason whatsoever. And that's really not what they're used for. And I'm going to show you how to avoid falling into that trap and why it shouldn't always be the case. And then talk about some ways of kind of again, making it a little bit more fun, more creative. But as a side part of, or as a side step or side, whatever you want to call it, of this idea of making the world, the environment seem more lived in, is that it's also going to help build your story. It's world building, because if you have wandering monsters in a specific section and you've keyed your own list, you're not just using something straight out of the monster manual. You're not using these lists like I showed you here that Gary was using. These aren't specific to the Caves of Chaos. And that's why I didn't use them, because these had nothing to do with the adventure. Okay. But doing your own and putting them in there and then seeing, are these going to come up where your characters can bump into them? Then that allows you to come up with a reason of why they're there, what they're doing, and it helps you to, again, expand your world building, and it adds to your story. Now, you could, I guess, prescribe exactly where they were going to be and just say, I want my players to run into these, and so I'll put them there. Yeah, you can do that. But then again, you're once again removing that element of surprise, because what happens if you had planned for this encounter to do and you put on your wandering monster and it never comes up? Well, now you have to pivot and come up with a reason why that didn't happen. And that's actually fun. It's actually fun to not know. Now, I know that I said that saying that a DM challenge was a weak excuse for having wandering monsters. It's weak if it's the only reason, but having it as part of the idea that the DM can also be surprised is a huge part of, for me, using wandering monsters. Now, the second main reason that wandering monsters, I think, are a good idea and why they integrate well into the game is for resource management. So I know that sometimes people really hate those two words and it's almost like dirty words to them or whatever. I have a whole video in this when I talk about resource management in my video on the D&D magic system. So make sure to see that. But one of the things that I pointed out in that video is something like playing with Lego bricks. These are some of my daughters. Is resource management. You have a limited number of bricks, and if you want to build the thing that you want to build, you need to make sure that you use them efficiently in the right way so that you can complete and build the thing, again, that you want to build. And nobody really ever says, oh, Lego bricks, playing with Lego bricks is boring, right? So I think it's all about how you present it. If you present it the right way, people might not necessarily think of it as being boring. My daughter, in her game, we use resource management all the time. And it's because I didn't tell them that it was boring and they shouldn't do it. We just started doing it. Now, for full disclosure, she and her friends have no context of what a game without resource management looks like because they've never played one before. This is the only D&D game that they've played. However, they really get into it. Okay, and wandering monsters are something that I employ in my game because it's all related. All these mechanics are related. And when you start pulling bits and pieces of them out, things kind of start to fall apart a little bit. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to understand, why are rules written for the game the way that they're written? Why were they put in there? So that before you decide to change it and pull it out, you understand what its purpose was. So as an example, with the resource management kind of model, thinking about it, what you have are adventurers that are trying to spend their resources to accomplish goals within a specific time limit. So that's a key part of that phrase, is the time limit. If you send your characters off as a DM on a quest to go accomplish a thing and you don't give them a time limit for that thing to be accomplished, then you've taken away all of the urgency and they're going to, take as much time as they need. That's where you get into the situations like the 5-minute adventuring day. That was a huge problem before, where characters would spend all of their resources, in just 1 or 2 encounters. And then they would be done for the day. And they're just like, well, we're going to camp and rest overnight so we can replenish all of our things. That's why 5e has things like long rests and short rests and all this kind of stuff, is so that characters will keep adventuring. However, if you take out the short rest, okay, then what you're doing is, or really in the way you don't have to take it out, but if you put them on a time limit where they can't stop to take the short rest, now you put urgency back into the game, right? You've put something, an element in there where the characters have to think, how are we going to expend our resources? Okay, so they're expending resources with things like food and water, of course, ammunition for bows and crossbows or slings, torches, oil. Okay, but also things like spells. Magic is a resource. So I know a lot of people, like, especially in 5e, they'll say like, oh, it's pointless to track food and water because the druid has Goodberry and just it's done. You just cast it and it's figured out. Or why do you need spell or why do you need torches and to see? Well, first off, in 5e you don't, because almost everybody has dark vision. But let's say that you have a character who doesn't have dark vision and you had a torch. Well, no, you don't need that because you're just going to use a light spell. Well, guess what? Those are still resources. If you're casting create food and water or purify food and water or Goodberry or light, any of these things that are taking the place of a resource, even cure light wounds, if you think about it, anything that's replenishing a resource and taking the place of using that resource, you're still expending a resource. You're just expending it differently. You're expending a spell resource. You could have used that spell slot or the time to cast that spell for something else. You could have prepared a different spell that you might need later on. But if you're just using them for the purposes of avoiding resource management, you're kind of tricking yourself a little bit, because you're still engaging in resource management just in a different manner, right? So there's that. Guess what else is a resource? Hit points are a resource. Okay, so when you go into an encounter, one of the things that characters should be considering, and my daughter's group considers this all the time, they don't think of it from the standpoint of like, are we going to waste our hit points going to this battle? They don't make it mechanical like that, but that's the decision that's going through their heads. Do we have enough force to defeat these guys? And is it going to be worth it in case something else worse comes along later? Because again, they're always on a time limit. They don't have time to go back to, to heal or to do whatever it is that, people would do, like, rememorize their spells and things like that. So they have to pick and choose when they use their spells, knowing that for the most part in a single adventure, they're only probably going to get to cast that spell once, because they're not going to have time to rest and memorize it again. So that is a tactical decision on when to expend that resource. Okay. So the other resource is time. Okay, that's probably the biggest one of all. So you'll see all these reasons. Actually, it's in the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, where it talks about like reasons why you might want to use random encounters. And it talks about like, making a sense of urgency and all these kinds of things. All those reasons that they give in there are pretty good. But what it really boils down to, it does talk about expending player resources. But if you think of resources as a bigger issue, including time as a resource, you can just collapse it all into this one bucket idea. So if the characters, like, let's say they come to a locked door, okay, and you have a thief or a rogue who's considering picking the lock. So you have to make a decision. Is it worth the time for me to spend to stay here as the group, spending our torch oil, spending, maybe we need to eat because it's whatever it is, right? You're spending all this time there for the thief to pick the lock. Or should we risk making a lot of noise and just bash it down with strength, or chop it down with an axe or something like that, which will be much quicker, but is going to create noise? Both opportunities of those, both actions are increasing your chances of wandering monsters. It's just one of them is probably a little bit more likely. So bashing the door down, I would say that's going to draw attention, unless there's a miracle that happens, like, if you plan it the right way, if you expend a resource to cast silence 15-foot radius so that it makes no noise when you're bashing down the door, I guess you could do that, right? But if you don't do that, it's going to make noise. However, the thief or rogue picking the lock takes time. And the more time that goes by, the more you're increasing your chance that you're going to roll a wandering monster, right? So you're balancing everything. So once you remove the wandering monsters out of that equation, then the resource management part of that sort of becomes, it's not relevant any longer. Because they don't have to think about expanding. They can take as long as they want, because they're not going to draw the monster. Or they can make all the noise they want, because they know it's not going to make any difference. Now, the other, again, every decision leads to a repercussion. Bashing the door down, okay, the other thing that comes from that means you can't close the door behind you. You can't protect your back as you move into a new area, because you've knocked the door down. Or you can't flee and close it behind you and have a wizard like hold portal or wizard lock or something like that, right? Because the door's been destroyed. So that's how I like to approach the game, is thinking about it in these decisions of every decision is going to have a repercussion, and which is the right one. And sometimes you make the wrong one, but they're all related. And again, once you start pulling these threads and trying to take pieces out that you don't like because it's not moving your story along, it changes why these other elements of the game also exist. So I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about then, how do I use wandering monsters? Well, you've seen this notebook before. This is my one where I write down my notes, kind of my scribble notes really quick by hand before I transfer them to here. But as an example, here was a wandering monster table that I made for the Caves of Chaos. So I made my notes here, and then I changed a little bit, but I was saying check every 3 turns, or when they were making a lot of noise, Okay, but you see, my monster, this isn't the list that was in the rule book. So I have the executioners. So that is a rival adventuring party that this group had heard of. They knew that they existed. And I knew what was going on behind the scenes was that these guys were following them and basically mopping up whenever the group moved on. And then a lot of times they would end up stealing the treasure from them. And the characters weren't aware of that. So they weren't finding treasure, and they didn't realize it was because these guys were sort of like, following them around. So they eventually did have an interaction with them, but it could have happened sooner had I rolled the execution. And that would have been fun. It would have been, really interesting to see what would have happened had the characters interacted with these, or even more so, interacting with them maybe before they even knew who they were. They'd seen notes posted about them on the message board, but they hadn't seen them before and didn't know what they look like. Now, the reason there are 6 is because I made this rival adventuring party, so there was one character for each. One NPC for each of the player characters. At the time, we had 6. We only have 4 now because 2 of them moved. But that was the execution. Now, these acolytes, I've talked about these guys before, but in this adventure, there are some NPCs in here. There's a traveling priest, and he's supposed to be a bad guy. I ended up changing him to make him a good guy, but he's traveling with 2 acolytes, like low-level priests, and I kept them as bad guys. They're cultists. They belong to the cult, and I think it's Cave K in here. Maybe it's Cave J. I think it's Cave K. But in any sense, there's an evil chaos cult in there. And so these 2 acolytes are supposed to be at the keep, but they're interacting with the cult in the caves. So they would be traveling back and forth. And I thought that'll be interesting to have that if the player characters run into them on the road. How are these guys going to deal with it? Now, I had specifically said that they were new acolytes. And so part of their training was that they were undergoing vows of silence. I just think it would have been really suspicious had the players run into them. And I think, again, it would have been really fun to figure out like what was going on with these guys. It just never happened. But I had some goblins. I had some lost guards from the keep who'd been sent before. And I thought could have been fun to run into them. Maybe they've holed up in a specific area and they're using and they're feeding on rats and things like that, but they can't get out because they're trapped. Again, some of these just never came up. Bandits on Patrol definitely came up. There was an orc from a different cave, and he was a messenger. That came up. There were cultists running around. That one didn't come up. Fire Beetle, I think that happened, or it was either the Fire Beetle or Giant Squirrel. Okay, Sturgis, Giant Centipede, and then I had like guards that had deserted. They left their post and maybe like joined the bandits or something like that. So I made my own specific table, which was relevant to the events that were happening in the campaign. And that's why I don't think of it as like, a random group of goblins shows up and attacks the party and it doesn't move the story along. This is all related, but I didn't necessarily put it in to prescribe when or even if it was going to happen. Like, I just decided, like, it's, it'll happen if it happens. And if it doesn't, like, that's fine. Okay. So these characters went for years of playtime, but, like dozens of sessions before they ever had any interaction with the executioners because I never rolled it on the table here and it just didn't come up. Okay, so that is one thing that you can do, again, to make it more relevant. Now, another thing that I think is really cool in these rules, because again, I've talked before, is that an encounter does not necessarily mean a combat. At least it doesn't have to. And I prefer to think of it that way, that it's not a combat. Now, I love this table. This is the Monster Reactions table from 1981 basic D&D. So when you have an encounter, the first thing that the DM does is roll on this table 2d12, and it determines the reaction of the other side. Okay, and it's always going to default to like the highest percent of chance happening is uncertain, monster, confused. Okay, so the way that you use this is to give the PCs an opportunity to maybe not have an encounter, and instead of expending resources in the form of hit points and time during combat, maybe they expend resources in the form of bribes of food, depending on the creature and how intelligent it is, or bribes of gold, bribes of items, things like that, where again, you're still expending resources, but you're making the choice in how you're going to expend that resource. Are you going to expend hit points in combat, or are you going to expend other things and hope that you don't need them later to avoid a combat? Okay, so these are all decisions that can be made. But if you go into every fight as the DM, assuming that the monsters are just going to attack on sight, then yeah, that gets super repetitive. And as a player, I would hate that because, as you know, it's not really adding things to the game other than making me, war of attrition wear me down. But if I use this table and then come up with reasons why the monster might not fight, that can be really fun. Now, I did a bunch of tables before, and I posted them on Instagram, but I'll put a link to that down below. But if you want the like a format like this, like, for like a PDF as an example, send me an email. So I'll put my email address up here, but send me an email and I can send you these tables. But basically what I did was, why are the monsters attacking? And I did, is it 5? I think it's for all. Yeah. So I did, okay, if it says immediate attack, why might that be? And that's a random table that gives you, I think it's 6 reasons of why they would immediately attack. And then I did one for hostile. What might that mean? And then I give a little thing of like, how can the characters avoid a fight with that result? And then uncertain, same thing. No attack, same thing. And enthusiastic friendship, same thing. But it's basically like, why would the monsters react that way? And it's random, so it gives the referee or the DM, whatever you want to call it, the opportunity to then come up with a reason. And again, that's adding to your story. It's adding to your world building, and it's making random encounters more fun, more creative, and more unexpected. Now, another thing that I do when I come across creatures in my campaign, like encounters. Now, I didn't make these tables. I found these online. I just reprinted them. But these are, what is the monster doing? So when you come across monsters, and this could work for wandering monsters as well, what is it that they're doing? And so this one on the left is like they're caring for something, or maybe they're marking territory or making a trap, or they're crafting or sharpening a weapon. They're not always just on patrol with weapons out ready to attack. Sometimes they might be, but they don't always have to be. Maybe they're eating or cooking, or there's, whatever. And then over here, it's like they're at play, or maybe they're being eaten, or they're building, or they're a decoy, or maybe they're disease. So it's, again, ways of making your monsters much different than just the standard, packet of hit points that you have to beat down if you beat their armor class so that, you can win and gain XP. Make monsters different and add these elements to them so that they're not the same every time. So that's something, and again, you don't have to save this for wandering monsters, but I think it comes in really handy with wandering monsters to kind of help keep the wandering monster idea useful in the game. Okay, and then the last thing I do, and again, this isn't necessarily anything that has to be specific to a wandering monster, but again, I do think it helps, is I created a couple of tables, and I did mine specifically for goblins because I had so many goblins in these caves, and the characters were in the goblin caves for quite a while at the very, very beginning, and I was trying to help my goblins be different from each other. And so I created some tables, and I posted them I think on Twitter and on Instagram again, but one was like, it's a very common thing in old school D&D style games is to make tables like, my goblins are X, like, my goblins are ... and then you make a table. So I did a table but I made them weird. So things like, your tongue can lash out and grab things at a distance and things like that. So it wouldn't be like every goblin's like that, but like maybe you come across one and it's like that. So I have these tables here. And again, if you want these, I can send them to you. Just send me an email. And then I did another one, a follow-up that was, I called it like weird goblin skins, but it was things like, maybe their skin is like poisonous to the touch, kind of like, there's poisonous frogs and things like that. And I thought that would be something unexpected that you wouldn't get from a goblin. And you can add that. And these are things that you could really add, and they're edition neutral. So you could pretty much add these in any edition of the game that you're playing, or any class and level type game or fantasy game, I should say. But I did those. I have many more of these kinds of tables. So I have a whole thing I crowdsourced on Twitter of like weird eyes. And I got 70 some things where a creature, it could be a one-off, or it could be a whole tribe or a whole group or whatever, subspecies, whatever, that have different weird, crazy eyes. Okay. So Definitely, if you want those, let me know and check them out. But you can make this kind of stuff yourself. Think about what makes sense within your environment, your milieu, your campaign, and then how can you tweak it slightly so that every goblin or every bandit or whatever it is that your players come across isn't identical every time, and it's they're not rolling their eyes or whatever, but it's giving them a reason to interact and talk. Use the monster reaction tables. And if you don't like that table, this 2d6 table that was in here that I showed you earlier, so maybe this isn't for you because you're playing 5e and you want to add your bonuses and all that kind of stuff, fine, make it put a DC on it. What is the DC that the monster is going to attack? And then have the players roll and add their charisma if they want, or like whatever it is, right? You can change the mechanic. You don't have to use 2d6. I like the 2d6 because of the bell curve as opposed to a linear curve from a d20. But, again, you can adapt it for your edition and, look at the idea of like, add some random monsters back in and just see what happens. Don't go into it thinking that it's just a boring encounter, because I think they can be so much more than that. So that's going to be it for this particular video. So thank you so very much for watching. And I'm going to turn my page here, check my notes. So next up, I think I might do this. It's going to come later. I don't know if it's going to be exactly the next time, but I recently just got a copy of this on Blu-ray. This is The Dreams in Gary's Basement. It's a documentary movie about Gary Gygax and his role in the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. And it's like a complimentary movie in a way to The Secrets of Blackmoor. So I just got this on Saturday. Today's Monday. I watched it yesterday, Sunday night, and I'm thinking of like kind of doing a review and talking about it. So that should be coming up at some point. But in the meantime, I want to hear from you. Do you use wandering monsters? Do you hate wandering monsters? If you do use them, how do you use them? Is it different from the way that I do it? What's your system? So leave all of that in the comments below and let me know. And also, while you're down there, go ahead and check out my links to join me on social media and check out my blog. I'm starting to blog a little bit more often now, as you'll see when you go on there. And lastly, if you could just share this with anybody who's interested in the history of D&D or in DM advice, I would really appreciate your help. And of course, like and subscribe. And with that, I'm going to say once again, thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. Please help support More Daddy Roll to One by buying a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, or other items from my shop. Thank you. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I worked on my notes for this video. So I had a lot of fun actually working on this video. I started working on the notes last week on my morning walk, and I do hope you enjoyed it. I know it's kind of not a traditional history video that I do, but I'm trying to expand from that. And I know there's a lot of folks out there that like DM advice, so I hope that you found the advice useful for using wandering monsters, or like a new way to approach how to use them in your games. But in any event, I was drinking one of these. So this is an improved whiskey cocktail. I express the oils from my lemon. I'll just drop it in there. So the short version is what we now call an old-fashioned cocktail would have originally, before that, just been called an old-fashioned whiskey cocktail, because you can make an old-fashioned with any kind of spirit. A lot of people don't know that. They think it has to be whiskey or bourbon, and it does not. I make them with gin all the time. But even way before that, it was just called a whiskey cocktail. And you could also have like a brandy cocktail. A cocktail is spirit, sugar, water, bitters. Okay, so an improved whiskey cocktail is taking that, but people started to experiment with all these new ingredients that were available. So the two things that are in this that kind of set this apart, make it a little bit different than a standard old-fashioned cocktail. So it has two types of bitters, Peychaud and Angostura. It has a rinse of absinthe. Now I used an atomizer, so I spray it inside my glass. It just gets better coverage and you don't waste as much. And then in addition to the simple syrup or the sugar, it has a bar spoon of Luxardo Maraschino Liqueur. And so that's what makes this improved. Now, the recipe for improved cocktails is not consistent. You can have an improved version of a cocktail that deviates from, the maraschino, the absinthe, like whatever. The idea is that you're making small changes, very, very small. So there's only a bar spoon of maraschino in here. There's a rinse of absinthe. It's very, very limited, but you can tweak existing, so-called old-fashioned recipes and add new ingredients and make them, improved. So that's this one. Cheers. I used rye whiskey in mine, by the way. And then this, what I was listening to, again, trying to get a little bit out of jazz and show you guys something different. This is Dirty Projectors, the band, and the album is Beta Orca. And this was released in 2009. I guess you'd call it indie rock, but even the band themselves didn't know how to categorize this. So it did make number 12 on the indie, rock list the year it came out, I think. So I'm going to call it indie rock, but I wasn't sure how I was going to like this. I'd never heard it before until I got the album. It came in my monthly subscription for Vinyl Me Please, as you see here on the Obi strip. And I loved it so much. So it's just become part of my regular rotation. It's a double album, 2 LP in here. And I just really enjoy the tracks. So this is something I've listened to enough that I could put it on. And I don't want to say ignore it. That's not what I was doing. But I've told you before, I have trouble concentrating and focusing when I'm listening to music with lyrics as I'm trying to work on notes or write. But this is something that, because I've listened to it enough, that it kind of, I hate to say went in the background, because I was trying to pay attention to it as well. But I do really enjoy it. Highly recommend giving it a chance if you've never heard it before. I'm sure you can look it up on your, whatever streaming service you're using. But that's going to be it. So once again, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for staying through the bonus content. I do just very much appreciate that. And I will talk to you next time. Cheers.